In the early 19th century, stories emerged of mysterious ruins that lay buried and forgotten deep inside the jungles of Central America. But a lost civilization in this region was thought to be impossible in the 1800s. Everyone knew that the continent had only ever been peopled by savages. But they couldn't have created such sophisticated structures. Someone else must have done it.
So Egyptians or Asians had come to Central America and built these ruins and then left again.
But then an American lawyer named John Lloyd Stephens and a British artist, Frederick Catherwood, went to see these ruins for themselves.
An artist and a lawyer go into a jungle. I mean, how more preposterous can it be?
They traveled hundreds of miles through the jungles of Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras to search for the ruins. Eventually, they uncovered the remains of 44 cities.
It was extraordinarily exciting for them because they knew they'd found something the world had never seen before.
With their astonishing discoveries, the two amateur explorers overturned everything we thought we knew about the history of the New World. This is the amazing story of how Stephens and Catherwood discovered one of the world's greatest civilizations, the Maya. John Lloyd Stephens was born to a prosperous New Jersey family in 1805. He was classically educated, a trained lawyer, and a rising Democratic Party politician. And so he might have remained, but for a chance event. During a mayoral campaign in 1834, Stephens's voice became so hoarse with public speaking that he developed a serious throat infection. His doctor advised an immediate change of climate. Stephens took his doctor at his word. He enjoyed the thrill of traveling around Europe and the Middle East, writing about his adventures amongst the ruins of the Old World.
By the mid-1830s, he goes to Egypt and the Holy Land. He travels to Greece and Poland and Russia, and he really takes to it. He seems to have a real talent for travel writing.
On his way back to New York, Stephens stopped off in London in 1836. Here, he met Frederick Catherwood, a well-known British artist.
Catherwood was trained as an architect to begin with, so he understands buildings, he understands structure. And then he goes to the Royal Academy schools in London and trains as an artist.
Catherwood studied under some of the greatest masters of his time. Turner gave him lessons on perspective. Others taught him how to draw buildings, and Catherwood became a highly accomplished architectural painter. Like Stephens, Catherwood had traveled to many of the great ruins of Europe and the Middle East between 1821 and 1832.
Stephens and Catherwood acquired, really, very extensive knowledge, both of them, of the kind of archaeology that was known about at that time in the Old World.
While Stephens had written about these ancient worlds, Catherwood had painted their ruins in great detail. But then, Stevens and Catherwood would hear rumors of a new world civilization, which would define the path they would follow for the rest of their lives.
They come together and discuss what is just about on the radar at the time, and this is these curious remnants of some sort of ancient civilization in Central America.
Catherwood showed Stevens an intriguing book called Descriptions of an Ancient City. Published in 1822, it displayed illustrations of ruins with palaces and pyramids covered with characters and symbols in a mysterious place called Palenque in southern Mexico.
Catherwood showed him a series of books. One of them provided quite an avid description of Palenque, but had decided that, like so many scholars of the time, that it couldn't have been the native Indians that had created these ruins.
The idea that there had ever been a Native American civilization deep in the jungles of Central America was unthinkable to many in the 1800s.
Indigenous Indians could not have built these ruins, could not have built such great palaces, and they were magnificent palaces for a culture that never moved beyond stone tools.
Indians, according to historians of the day, were thought to be savage and primitive, and not capable of building such sophisticated cities. The view was that the ruins at Palenque must have been the work of other cultures.
They must have been an ancient culture from across the sea. So Egyptians or Asians had come to Central America and built these ruins and then left again.
The reason for this view was that historians had very fixed ideas. Critically, they believed all civilizations had to conform to a certain set of rules.
In the 1830s, I mean, Stevens and Catherwood, when talking about civilization, would define it in terms of cities and impressive-looking architecture. Evidence of rulers and rule, complex kind of agricultural systems, a writing system.
And then there is time for people to be artists, to sculpt monuments, to study the sciences, travel, trade, have a wealth of goods, have teachers, schools.
Everyone agreed that the primitive nomadic people of Central America couldn't have achieved anything like this. Though they weren't professional historians, Stevens and Catherwood believed that those who held that view were wrong. They could see no evidence that Egyptians and Phoenicians had ever been to Central America, and the images they were looking at were very different to anything they had seen in the Old World. They must have been made by an unknown Native American culture.
Stevens and Catherwood were extraordinarily different people. I mean, that's what makes them so marvelous as a pair, as a sort of Holmes and Watson, you know, of Maya archaeology. They could see that was evident in the New World was something very, very different.
He and Catherwood together were the first to look at these sites without the filters of thinking about Old World archaeology. Both are very much interested in these being indigenously authored sites.
These illustrations and vague accounts of a lost city aroused Stevens and Catherwood's curiosity. They decided to look further. Two years later, in 1838, Stevens got another lead. A New York bookseller showed him several more works relating to ruins in Central America. One was a large folio based on the personal explorations and illustrations of French archaeologist Jean-Frédéric Waldeck, which had just been published in Paris. These pages showed again the illustrations of the Palenque ruins in Mexico, first made known to Stephens by Catherwood. And there was more. The book also revealed illustrations of another strange ruin in Uxmal, in the Yucatan region of Mexico. Stephens then learned from the bookseller that yet a further set of ruins were said to exist in an area called Copan, in modern-day Honduras.
Stephens had read an account by a man called Juan Galindo, who'd actually been to Copan and written a description of what he'd seen there.
Monstrous figures are found among the ruins. One, a colossal alligator, having in its jaws a figure with a human face, but with the paws of an animal.
Discover the past with exclusive ancient history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything from the wonders of Pompeii to the rebellion of Boudica and the mysteries of prehistoric Scotland. Immerse yourself in the captivating stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
Stephens was stunned. He had now heard of 3 separate ruined cities. Palenque in southern Mexico, Uxmal in the Yucatan, and Copan in Honduras, all in the same region but hundreds of miles apart. And who knew if there were any more? Stephens began to wonder, could these ruins be evidence that there had once been a great civilization in that region?
He is, among the first of these explorer writers to begin connecting the dots and thinking about this as a coherent civilization.
Stephens could see that there must be some connection between these ruins. And these weren't just one palace here and one palace there, completely different groups. There must have been something between them.
Back at home, Stephens became convinced he was onto something and was determined to find these 3 ruins he'd learned about: Palenque, Uxmal, and Copan. He began to plan an expedition to Central America. Because Stephens was now earning substantial royalties from his successful travel books, he invited his artist friend, Frederick Catherwood, to go with him. Stephens sent him word to get ready. The deal meant that Catherwood would illustrate any ruins they find in Central America, and Stephens would pay for it. Catherwood packed his brushes, paints, and reams of paper. He also packed machetes and pistols, as there was a real chance of trouble where they were going. British Honduras and Guatemala were in the middle of a violent border dispute, and the area was considered a very dangerous place to visit. Stephens realized that they were going to need all the help they could get. He persuaded the US President, Martin Van Buren, to appoint him as a special ambassador to Central America, to help ease their way through the unstable region.
He's even given a special sort of frock coat to wear for the sort of official occasions. So he has that diplomatic mission which runs alongside the artistic and historical mission.
The only problem was, the 4 previous US ambassadors to have held this position had all died in office in Central America. Stevens received a letter from one of their widows, whose husband had died of malaria. It concluded with the ominous words, "May you be more fortunate than any of your predecessors have been." Stevens and Catherwood left New York on the 3rd of October, 1839, determined to locate the three ruins buried deep in the jungles of Central America. After a month at sea, the two explorers arrived in Belize on the northeastern coast of Central America. Their plan was to first head towards one of the mysterious lost cities Stevens had heard about in New York. It was called Copan, and it lay in the western region of Honduras, close to the Guatemalan border. In honor of Stevens' diplomatic position, they were guests of the British governor in Belize, Colonel MacDonald, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. MacDonald warned them they were entering dangerous country, and his diplomatic pass would hold no sway with any rebel forces they may encounter. MacDonald put Stevens and Catherwood on a government steamboat and told them that if danger did threaten, they were to hang out their flag and send word to him. Then he sent them on their way with a 13-gun salute. Undaunted, they arrived on the coast of eastern Guatemala the following morning. Now the two explorers had to climb over the Mico mountain range to reach the Guatemalan border with Honduras. Once there, they would enter Honduras and go on to Copan. Stevens hired a guide who was fluent in Spanish and knew the grueling mountain pass that loomed ahead. Although only just over 4,000 feet, Mico Mountain was a treacherous route to cross. Stevens later described their experience in his book of the expedition, Incidents of Travel in Central America.
For 5 long hours, we were dragged through mud holes, squeezed in gullies, knocked against trees, and tumbled over roots. Every step required care and great physical exertion. I felt that our inglorious epitaph might be tossed over the head of a mule, framed by the trunk of a mahogany tree, and buried in the mud of Mico Mountain.
Catherwood looked at Stevens and groaned.
If I'd known of this cursed Mico Mountain before I agreed to come, you would have come to Central America alone.
Here's a guy in a jungle with guns on each hip and a sword, and in all likelihood wearing shades because he suffered from eye problems, inflammation of the iris, and there's a reference to him wearing spectacles. I mean, that picture, when you think about it, I mean, Keith Richards got nothing on that.
Over the next 2 weeks, the party hacked through jungles and traversed perilous ravines.
It was jungle, end-to-end jungle, with no roads or places to stop off for the night. Food was a big issue. It seemed like they lived on chocolate and cigars most of the time.
They passed hillsides with grazing cattle that reminded Stevens of rural England, were hounded by biting insects and tropical fevers. And there was also the ever-present threat of running into ruthless rebels.
People get very nasty in civil wars, and the factions were already known to have committed atrocities and massacres and whatnot, and they had a very real suspicion of foreigners.
One evening, Stevens and Catherwood set up camp in an abandoned church. As they slept, drunken soldiers burst in, brandishing swords and muskets. Stevens recalled this incident in his account of the expedition.
Here we were in the hands of men who would have been turned out of any decent state prison lest they should contaminate the other inmates. Their appearance was ferocious, and doubtless, if we had attempted to escape, they would have been glad of the excuse for murder.
Luckily, the following morning, the soldiers had sobered up. Stevens and Catherwood were allowed to continue their journey to Copan. "14 days after arriving in Belize, the two men finally reached the area of Copan, a remote jungle region, little known by locals and rarely visited by travelers. As the two explorers worked their way through the dense forest, they suddenly came to a bank of a river. Across the water, Stephen's eyes fell on a large stone wall rising out of the undergrowth. It was 100 feet high and covered in thick, constricting vines.
It had more the character of a structure than anything we had ever seen ascribed to the Aborigines of America.
Stevens and Catherwood crossed the river to investigate. Stevens would vividly describe their experience of Copan and how they first set eyes on the ruins in his book of the expedition.
I am entering abruptly a new world. It is impossible to describe the interest with which I explored these ruins. The ground was entirely new. There were no guidebooks or guides. The whole was a virgin soil. We could not see 10 yards before us and never knew what we should stumble upon next.
Stevens realized they had to clear the ruins of its tangle of jungle vines before they could really understand what lay beneath them. Just as they were about to begin, they had an unexpected problem. The local landowner appeared. Stevens explained he wanted to clear and explore the ruins and offered to buy the land.
When his host is sort of balking at the idea, the first thing that Stevens does is he opens up his trunk, pulls out his diplomatic, sort of uniform, and claims that his host was overwhelmed by his shiny, American Eagle buttons.
At last, Stevens' diplomatic status became useful. He was allowed to purchase the Copan land for $50. Now, they could set to work. The following morning, the systematic clearing of the Copan ruins began.
Copan was extraordinarily overgrown at this point, so they were seeing little bits and pieces of Copan at a time.
At one time, we stopped to cut away branches and vines, which concealed the face of a monument, and dig around and bring to light a fragment, a sculptured corner of which protruded from the earth.
It'd be like finding one statue in Egypt and not knowing yet that the pyramids were there.
We go now and we travel there now, and they look very clinical almost, because they're very nicely cut lawns and all of the trees have been taken away. But they would have seen them thoroughly immersed in jungle.
I leaned over with breathless anxiety. An eye, an ear, a foot, or a hand was disentombed. And when the machete rang against the chiseled stone, I cleared out the loose earth with my hands.
As Stevens ran the excavations, Catherwood set up his station in the jungle to record the mysterious structures they were discovering. He used a piece of equipment called a camera lucida to help him detail what he was seeing with great accuracy.
He had with him this apparatus, the camera lucida. The light came through a kind of prism and gave you an image which you could see on a piece of paper, and you could pretty much sketch it or trace it. And it was a great help to Catherwood.
Catherwood, with his incredible knowledge of architecture, must have realized right away that this was something quite unique and that he was in a unique place, qualified to record it.
As Stevens and Catherwood gradually cleared away the jungle vines, they began to unearth evidence of a very sophisticated society.
They saw fantastic little elements of sculpture which intrigued them. And then eventually, as they carried on, they began to see these very large, great big monoliths. Seeing these, which clearly convinced them that this was something, they'd never seen anything like that before.
Working our way through the thick woods, we came upon a square stone column, about 14 feet high and 3 feet on each side from the base to the top. The front was the figure of the man, curiously and richly dressed, and the face evidently a portrait. Our guide called it an idol. And before it was a large block of stone sculptured with figures, which he called an altar. The sight of this unexpected monument gave us the assurance that the objects we were in search of were interesting not only as the remains of an unknown people, but as works of art, proving that the people who once occupied the continent of America were not savages.
Right away, you can see how open he is, because he doesn't say, oh, that's a monster or a crude representation of the devil or something. He observes that they're very complex, must have been made by very talented people.
As the days passed, Stevens and Catherwood uncovered monumental structures that could have housed hundreds of people, and building blocks that showed all the hallmarks of a great civilization. They found large squares, terraces, and platforms with stepped pyramids, temples, ceremonial buildings, and shrines with altars.
We reached a terrace so overgrown with trees that at first we could not make out its form, but which, on clearing, we ascertained to be a square, and with steps on all the sides, as perfect as those of the Roman amphitheater.
I think they really were kind of astounded once they got to Copan, the extent of the cities.
The beauty of the sculpture, the desolation of the city, and the mystery that hung over it, all created an interest higher, if possible, than I'd ever felt among the ruins of the old world.
What is amazingly sort of human and endearing of him is the way he puts it, is that he says, after a time, looking at these things, it was evident these weren't the monuments of savages. These are sophisticated people.
Now, there could be no doubt. The two amateur men had found what professional historians had said could not exist. Proof that some form of civilization had once thrived in this area. And then came something even more extraordinary. Writing. Standing at the center of the ruins, their eyes fixed on a large stone monument with 16 seated human figures carved around it and 36 blocks of hieroglyphs on its top.
Catherwood knew from seeing all the Egyptian hieroglyphs that he'd drawn over and over again along the Nile that this was a writing system. And that the writing system, they talked together about this, probably had something to do with the images on the front.
As Stevens and Catherwood's eyes examined the hieroglyphs, they were aware that all the great cultures of the past had developed their own writing systems. The people of Copan had clearly done the same, just like the civilizations of the old world.
There were no associations connected with the place. None of those stirring recollections which hallow Rome, Athens, and the world's great mistress on the Egypt plain. But architecture, sculpture, and painting, all the arts which embellish life, had flourished in this overgrown forest. Orators, warriors, and statesmen, beauty, ambition, and glory had lived and passed away.
But it begged the question, who had built this place, and what had become of them?
The city was desolate. It lay before us like a shattered bark amidst the ocean, her masts gone, her name effaced, her crew perished, and none to tell whence she came, to whom she belonged, how long at her voyage, or what caused her destruction. In the ruined cities of Egypt, even in the long-lost Petra, the stranger knows the story of the vestiges around him.
Stevens was convinced the answer to who had built this civilization had to lie in the hieroglyphs. One day, when someone could read them, they would be able to understand the history of those who had lived here.
In regards to the age of this desolate city, I shall not at present offer any conjecture. One thing I believe, that its history is graven on its monuments.
Stevens really believed that these were historical documents, that they weren't simply, say, astronomical observations, that they're the stories of real people's lives.
Spurred on by their amazing discovery at Copan, Stevens and Catherwood continued their trek across Central America in search of other ruins.
They know that somewhere out there there's this palenque, and they've seen illustrations of that. So they were maybe already considering, well, maybe there's a very large area here. We don't know how it's constructed, whether it's an empire, whether these are kind of city-states. There was something definably similar across a wide area.
Over the next 2 years, they explored a vast region and traveled through Honduras, Guatemala, and the Yucatan in southeastern Mexico. Stevens and Catherwood uncovered, surveyed, and recorded another 43 ruined cities that had lain buried and forgotten for hundreds of years, including Uxmal, Palenque, Chichen Itza, and Tulum. And they found evidence of everything that people believed was needed for a civilization. Vast cities with central areas containing grand plazas, royal courts, and governors' palaces, proof of a sophisticated social hierarchy. Ornate temples, stepped pyramids, and monuments bearing hieroglyphic descriptions, proof of an organized religion. Gymnasiums and ball courts, astronomical observatories, intensive farming land, markets and trading centers, outlying villages, lookout towers and defensive walls with linking roads and causeways. All with a common architectural style that confirmed that there was once a single vast civilization here. Stevens and Catherwood returned to New York in the spring of 1842. They faced a new challenge. They had to convince the world that what they had discovered in Central America was truly groundbreaking. There really was a vast civilization that had once existed and thrived in a place where nobody believed there could be one. Stevens decided the best way to achieve this would be to publish a written, illustrated record of their expeditions. His first book, Incidents of Travel in Central America, came out in 1841 and was quickly followed by Incidents of Travel in Yucatan in 1843. Stevens' books contained over 200 Catherwood engravings and were an instant success, selling more than 20,000 copies within the first 3 months.
his volumes were really within the reach of the middle-class American reading public. And so the ruins reached a far wider audience than they ever had before.
Edgar Allan Poe called Stevens' work perhaps the most thrilling book on travel ever published. Catherwood then released his own volume, Views of Ancient Monuments in Central America, the following year. It documented their spectacular discoveries with 25 stunning hand-colored lithographs, which vividly brought the beautiful carved monuments, temples, and pyramids back to life.
What Catherwood did with his drawings was not so much just make pictures. He used the word draw in its larger sense of pulling. He pulled, basically drew an entire civilization out of the past into the present.
I think that there is a real parallel between Catherwood's painstaking illustration of every inch of a monument and Stevens doing the same thing in prose.
Together, the writings of Stevens and the illustrations of Catherwood would captivate the imagination of their readers.
Stephen had a fantastic rhetoric. His writing style was clear, descriptive, immersive, and he really portrayed a lot of his passion for what he was doing through his writing.
It was a perfect example of how the words and the images complemented one another. Neither one could have pulled this off on their own.
But for all their extraordinary revelations, there was still one question they could not answer. As Stevens wrote,
I now bid farewell to the ruins. I leave them with all mystery around them, and in the feeble hope that these imperfect pages may in some way throw a glimmer of light upon the great and long vainly mooted question: who were the peoplers of America?
Stevens and Catherwood would never know the answer. They both died early in their lives. Stevens from malaria at the age of 47, and Catherwood drowned when his ship sank crossing the Atlantic in 1854. He was 55. But eventually, Stevens' prediction would come true. When someone could read their hieroglyphic descriptions, they would understand who these people were. Over the next 170 years, the secrets of this culture's history were indeed proved to be in their writing.
Stevens is really the first Western explorer in Central America and Mexico, both to believe in indigenous authorship of the ruins and to glean the importance of the glyphs.
Archaeologists, inspired by Stevens and Catherwood's explorations, managed to read the writings and the images, and a picture emerged of the rise and fall of one of the world's greatest civilizations, the Maya. The earliest traces of their existence go back to 1500 BC, and possibly as far as 2500 BC. Their kingdoms stretched across a vast area of Central America, from southern Mexico to the Atlantic and the Caribbean coast of Belize. Stevens and Catherwood's first discovery, Copan, was established in 450 AD and lasted for 400 years. With 20,000 people in an area of 100 square miles, it was the Athens of Central America from the 5th to the 9th centuries AD, at a time when Europe was lost in the Dark Ages. Copan, by any standards, was a highly developed and advanced civilization.
The Maya were a hugely sophisticated society and culture. They had a very complicated mathematics system. They were one of the few ancient groups to use the concept of zero, which is hugely important for mathematics. They had very detailed astronomy. They knew the movements of the planets and stars. They mapped the movement of Venus, for example, with a great amount of detail. Their calendar was very, very accurate, more accurate in many ways than Western calendars of a similar period. They managed to build these temples without the use of metal tools. They had very little metalwork, other than gold and silver for decorative purposes. They never had the wheel. They didn't have pack animals. There was no horses or carts or anything like that. But they were able to create temples as large, if not larger than those in Egypt.
Stevens and Catherwood's revelation that a mighty Maya civilization lay buried in the Central American jungle was one of the greatest discoveries of their age.
An artist and a lawyer go into a jungle. I mean, how more preposterous can it be? But the thing was, the very different personalities with that overlap produced this amazing scope, which would never have happened if they hadn't been that different.
Stevens and Catherwood proved that you didn't need to be a professional academic to be a great historian. What you needed was passion, an attention to detail, and an open mind.
I think, essentially in finally judging their achievement, you have these two people that complement each other wonderfully well, with this extraordinarily vivid text and the marvelous illustrations. And what you do have here, you have two people that have established the study of the Maya.
It was remarkable, not just an intellectual achievement. It was a feat of endurance. These were heroes. They produced a remarkable event under life-threatening circumstances. I think it was one of the great exploratory triumphs, absolutely, in history.
With their astonishing discoveries, the two amateur explorers overturned every prejudice we had about the development of cultures in the New World. Stevens and Catherwood had proved beyond doubt Native Americans had constructed a sophisticated civilization that compared to any of the finest ancient civilizations of the Old World.